Department of Environmental History at Ashoka University in Delhi. He's a really eminent figure of environmental history in the field in India. He has published many books, including Nature Nation or Nature Without Border the year before in 2014. And right now he's going to approach the theme of faunal nationalism in an emerging economy, tigers, science, and society between the years 1969 and 2019. Thank you so much for being with us right now, Professor Mahesh, and the floor is yours.
Thanks. Would you like me to speak? Because I've sent a tape. Would you like to play the tape? What would you prefer?
You can start indeed, yes.
Okay, thank you. The idea of suggesting the theme of foreign nationalism was partly to try and get a perspective on where we stand today. I chose the theme of the tiger because in 1972, there was a very important change in India. The tiger replaced the lion as the national animal. The lion had been the national animal for barely 3 years. But the lion, as you know, had been very important as a symbol in the lion capital, which remains the symbol of the republic founded in 1950. In this 50-year period, there have been many changes in India. The India of late 1960s, early 70s was more rural. It was more dependent on agriculture. If you looked at the farm and other agriculture-related services and produce sustained about 75% of the workforce and formed well over half of the GDP. Today, agriculture accounts for less than 15% of the GDP and occupies only 45% of the workforce. Around the time the tiger became the national animal, there was also a view initially at the international level and also within India that it was an endangered species. This marked a very major change. As you know, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the hunting of the tiger was very important, not only for British civil and military officials, but also for the various princes who ruled over 1/3 of British India. If one were just to share the kind of records, one well-known prince in central India himself shot 1,157 tigers and over 2,000 leopards. This is an extreme case, but there were several others. And the view right into the end of the 1960s, it's a view which goes back to the imperial colonial period, was that the tiger was an impediment to the expansion of cultivation because it was a threat to livestock. And safari hunts were promoted in independent India as they had been in imperial India, even though most of the new rulers themselves did not hunt. It's significant as late as 1969 to come into New Delhi. You could go to a shikar safari outfitter, and for 40,000 rupees, they would guarantee you a tiger. By the time you got home, the tiger would have got there before you. Of course, it would be the skin of the tiger or the trophy of the tiger. Now, why and when did this change take place? And I've argued elsewhere that this was, of course, about a new consciousness among a section of foresters, naturalists, photographers, zoologists, a small section of the political leadership. It's a study done by the then director of Delhi Zoo, which estimated that there were only 2,500 tigers left, down from the figure often used 35,000 at the turn of the century. And the way he got to this figure was by multiplying the number of tiger skins you could buy legally in Delhi. And in 1969, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, when it met in Delhi, was addressed by the Prime Minister, very young Prime Minister, then one of only 3 women Prime Ministers in the world, the first in India. We haven't had one since. And she argued that we cannot see wildlife simply as a source of foreign exchange and squeeze the last rupee out of our forests. And the 4-footed and feathered inhabitants of the land are also creatures with the right to life and liberty. So there's a new kind of ecological patriotism which centers itself not only on the tiger, but on some other charismatic megafauna. In other animals which would come up for discussion would be the lion, found only in one forest area in Western India and Gir, a remnant of vast range across Asia, even 200 years ago. The elephant, the rhinoceros. And it's not a coincidence that all of these are species that have shrunk over the last 150 to 200 years, both in numbers and in living space. So why did the tiger become so significant? And one reason, of course, is not to do with the tiger itself, but the context. The late 1960s, early 70s were a period of great social, political, cultural turmoil. You were meeting in France, very important in 1968. And 1967-68 meant different things in different countries. But one thing clear was that the old order would not be able to last unless it made very significant changes, minimally for reform. And there were, of course, more radical calls for all-out transformation. In the Indian case, there were 2 years of rainfall failure, followed by very high level of reliance on American food imports. And this spurred what is widely known today as the Green Revolution, in which there was a focus on certain specific areas, very high yielding varieties to be planted with a lot of chemical inputs, high use of water. And in a space of 4 to 8 years, India ceases to be dependent on food aid. Hunger doesn't disappear, but it moves from a country dependent on food imports in times of drought to a country not dependent. Interestingly, the issue of forests and wildlife was framed at this time in agrarian terms. So in a first speech to a university in Bangalore in January of 67, Mrs. Gandhi would argue that forests had to be protected because they were a matter of security for rainfall. And the tiger, therefore, comes to be seen now as a keeper of order in the forest. It would be an index of ecological health of the forest by keeping the deer and boars in check. It was now seen not so much as a friend of the farmer, but the forest, or rather its home, was seen as critical in terms of ensuring the renewal of the water supply, the groundwater, the flowing of rivers. There are 9 tiger reserves created in 1973. The project itself was part of an international Operation Tiger, in which European-based World Wildlife Fund played an important role. So $1 million raised. India, Nepal, Bangladesh were among the countries which played an important role. And the idea was to have a series of tiger reserves. There were 9 initially. And within these, there would be places where there would be no forestry, no human habitation. There have been very important crises in tiger numbers since then. There was one in the early 90s. There was one in early 2000s. And it's significant that in Imperial India, that is British India, I heard very interesting talk just now on the French Empire. And it's important to keep in mind British Empire around 1918, end of Great War, was the largest land empire the world had ever seen. 1/4 of the land mass of Earth was within the British Empire. And one of the very important elements of the British Empire was the control of the forest. I just heard references to late Richard Grove, and more famous than him, me, and anyone perhaps in the room is a person who never existed. You know, Mowgli, the little wolf boy created by Rudyard Kipling. And Mowgli, when he grows up in the Kipling story, becomes a forest guard. Well, Mowgli, like many people, did get married and settle down, but his job was that he got his salary from the forest department. And Kipling celebrates how he chased away the goats so that they would not nibble at the leaves of the young saplings, which would grow into mighty oaks, which would provide timber for the railways. And it's in the railways which helped troops to go out and crush rebellion. The railways, of course, did a lot. They conveyed grain, tea, cotton, coffee. So this larger transformation in the imperial colonial era included taking over of over 600,000 square kilometers of land, which became government forest land. And in independent India, along with the areas of British India, many of the former princely states' forests also were taken over by government. And Project Tiger marked a difference in emphasis in the way these forests were viewed. A small part of them were now viewed as important for all life forms. A commercial forestry where they prized certain commercial hardwoods or timber yielding crops or revenue was given second place. It's significant this period from the late 60s to around 2000. There's a huge expansion of the sanctuaries and parks in India. It goes up almost tenfold. It's not large when you compare to, let us say, Eastern Africa. So in 2000s, we did a quick calculation that if you took all the tiger reserves in India, that it could come to less than 50,000 square kilometers. They would fit into one park in Tanzania called Selous. But I think the other dimension is very important, that the creation of these reserves involved fairly strict processes of exclusion. So many of the practices of the princes of the imperial era now were reinforced, but with the new logic of protecting very rare endangered species. India's first national park was Hilly Park, 1937, the first in Asia. And there were some national parks in the early period. But definitely between the 60s and 2000s, this new idea of preservation of nature becomes very important. There was use right now of the term wilderness, it becomes popular. Somewhat problematical term, because we know as students of history that these are landscapes and waterscapes which have had human presence not only for centuries, but millennia. And there's very significant work in Eastern India on the Sundarbans. Anu Jalai, a very fine book, Forest of Tigers, where she shows how the attempt to displace people led to a very violent incident where many of them lost their lives because they saw the mangrove forest as their home and the homesteads where they had created rice paddies as part of their right. They did not view the tiger as an enemy, even though this is the only part of the world where there is tigers preying on humans, definitely for the last few centuries. And there's complex reasons why. In fact, they argued, excellent ethnography, that the tigers too were refugees, and they claimed that they had fled from East Pakistan due to massacre by the army, and the tigers had fled massacre in Java and swam all the way to Bengal. Now, this is their imagery. Another very interesting recent work, Tigers Are Our Brothers, by Ambika Ayadurai, looks at the Adi Mishmi in the northeast state of Arunachal, and I think the title itself gives the story away. But larger than this, there is a second question, which is that in 1972, India decided to count its tigers. This was the first time a large vertebrate was attempted to be counted. And you know, the first decennial census of humans in India was in 1881. Rare cases censuses are not held, 1941, Second World War, 2021 due to the COVID-19 outbreak. But if we look at these censuses and earlier figures, it's interesting that in the 70s, India's population was around 600 million. It was estimated to be growing at 2.14% per year. Today in 2022, India has reached net reproductive rate, except in 5 states, admittedly 3 large states. So there is this neo-Malthusian fear also of growing numbers of humans with the retreating forest. And the tiger count, of course, did throw up a low number. And in the 2000s, when there was renewed fear of tiger extinction, because tigers were found to have died out in 2 reserves, one in Western, one in Central India. Subsequent studies, such as by Shahabuddin on Sarista, have shown that the extinction was not simply because of poaching for tiger bone. There was a complex set of factors, including the firewood trade from well beyond the reserve, often for urban markets. It could be mining, which was on the edge of the reserve. But I think what's significant is that in the 2000s, government adopted new ways of counting tigers with camera traps. The pioneer being an Indian Ulas Karan. Tigers are now counted in many parts of the world. They're very difficult to see. So you put up a camera with a tripwire and the tiger photographs itself. You then look at the difference between the stripes on the first, second, and third tiger, and so on and so forth. So there is now, of course, very significant numbers were supposed to be at 1,400 in 2005, down from 1,800 at the beginning of Project Tiger after an increase in the middle. The most recent estimate is close to 3,000. These figures, like all such issues and how well the techniques have been deployed, continue to be a matter of contention. But I think what is significant is that this is why I think the term faunal nationalism helps, is that one of the things we know about nationalism is that the nation is an imagined community. And Benedict Anderson argued it's fine to have a community where you all know each other. What if there's a community which is so large that you will never see each other, but you're willing to die for them, fight for them, kill for them? In this case, set aside land in the name of the nation, not for cultural heritage, let us say a monument, but for a piece of your natural heritage, in this case, the tiger. So there's a sense of ecological patriotism, which seems to be very significant in the 70s and 80s. And this is a very significant time in Indian foreign policy because its policy was broadly of non-alignment, not being part of the American or the Soviet-led bloc. And there was a lot of pride that the Project Tiger was an Indian project run largely with Indian money. It's not coincidence that from 72, the tiger began to be called in government lexicon, not the Bengal tiger, but the Indian tiger. So the tiger became Indian. And the tiger was found in 11 of 16 states. It was seen as symbol of unity in diversity. The reverse is very important, that nationalism does speak of a fraternity of all within the nation, but all are not equal. Some are more equal than others. And it's significant that the tiger reserves largely are in former timber reserve forests, often reserved for timber from British India, or the princely hunting reserves of the former rulers. Tiger, the project itself was launched in Cobbett Park, named after the legendary Manita hunter, the old Haley Park, and two of the parks well known where tigers are photographed easily. Ranthambore in Western India, Bandhavgarh in Central, were very famous as tiger hunting grounds because there are lakes in dry forest. And it's the same lakes that you find over the last 50 years that the same animal which was seen as nocturnal has dropped its nocturnal cloak and is seen around the jeeps of tourists. One of the points around the early 2000s is that I think this is one of the advantages of democracy, that over time, rulers began to be questioned. And the kinds of questions are raised by new groups of people. And just as in the 50s and 60s, a lot of politics in India was about land to the tiller, that is, the redistribution of land away from the rent collecting classes, where there were rentiers, and from large peasants to the landless peasantry with a land ceiling in other areas where government collected the revenue from the peasantry. Neither of these was phenomenally well done always, but there is a huge change which few would deny. This kind of assertion of rights was not possible in the state forest lands, which now encompass around 23% of the land area. That's a very large part of India. And in 2005-06, because of a lot of movements on the ground, there were attempts to restitute some of these rights. Around the same time, this new assessment system of the tiger, the report which was given admitted that there had been at very high-handed exclusionary methods of conservation, and it advocated that any displacement of peoples from tiger reserves should be with a better compensation package, and that the provisions should be brought in to redistribute tourism revenues. 15 years later, progress on both is halting, but I think that the shift in the idiom is significant. Of course, the India of 2022 is a very different country. Over the last 30 odd years, going back to the 80s, but certainly the last 30 years, India sees itself less as a non-aligned country and more as one of the emerging powers both in Asia and the world. This is evident even with the tiger. The success of tiger conservation is upheld in among the 13 countries which still have tigers. There has even been talk of facilitating reintroduction of tigers in Cambodia by sending tigers from India, though nothing much has happened. There's been cooperation between India and Nepal, India, Bhutan, India, Bangladesh on cross-border reserves. But what I think is significant is that this larger economic transformation, the emergence of India in the world of services, expansion of urban populations to almost over 1/3 of the numbers, which is over 300 to 400 million, has also come with much more of an extractive economy. So the new very important pressures on the forest, the hill areas, the mountain areas, the landscapes is of extraction of fossil fuels, gas, oil, of other fossil fuels, most important of all coal, but also manganese and iron ore. And very interesting recent unpublished work shows, if you look at central India, very large area of highlands stretching across several states, there are 300 major highways which will bisect, trisect, and cut up habitat. And the big debate today is where should the highway lead? Should there be underpasses? So, the old question was whether India can save the tiger and whether ecological patriotism would provide refuge. The answer is a qualified yes, it has saved the tiger. But what has it saved it from? Who has it saved it for? So one of the dilemmas of environmental history is environmental history about people, how we think about nature, where we draw the line with nature, whose nature it is, who speaks for nature. Of course it is. But environmental history has second dimension, which is that polities matter to nature. The way in which people exercise power over other people is very important to the way we relate to the web of life or to the way in which material flows happen. This is very evident in the Indian case, wherein in the 70s, there's a shift to petrochemical agriculture in a large way. So 2/3 of the tractors today, of the land is plowed by tractors. The plow bullock has vanished. At the same time, there's also a shift to faunal nationalism and a form of ecological nationalism, but often in a very exclusive way, which of course is challenged extensively in a democracy, not always successful. So when we look at the larger picture, given the significance of Asia, world history, Asia was very important in the Industrial Revolution. We know from the work of Ken Pomeranz and so many others. It was largely as a source of raw materials. The Industrial Revolution came late, but in the present situation where there is a integration of the world economy and India becomes important also as an importer of raw materials, as an exporter of services, as one of the major economies of the world. We estimate it to become the third largest economy sometime in the next 20 odd years. What happens to the ecological complex webs of life on land, water, and air? There is no clear answer except to say two things: that it's important to remember when one talks of endangerment, extinction, decline, dissonance, disequilibria, all of these are important. And they're even more important in a time of global changes of the Anthropocene. But this is also a landmass, India, South Asia, which has remained productive and biologically resilient, despite, or perhaps along with, centuries, I repeat, millennia of human presence and occupation. And it strikes me as very interesting that so much of focus has been there on small landmass, which is under strict protection. But there seems to be equal need to look at the very large areas where there is cohabitation of a range of species with people. Just to end on a somewhat interesting note, 1/3 of the tigers are outside of the protected areas. 2/3 of the lions range in Gujarat, admittedly low density, is outside protected areas. And 60% of elephant range is outside protected areas. This will call for a very different way of dealing with them because these are very difficult animals to live with. I must emphasize, I was just looking at, the loss of life due to plague and the so-called Spanish flu, roughly 1890s, 1899, 1900 to 1920. It's a staggering figure. Depending how you count it, it's 30 million or 50 million. So nowhere are the loss of life due to lions, tigers, elephants around that. However, loss of life does matter. 500,000 people lose crops due to elephants. They kill over 600 people a year, and most of those are people protecting their crops. So this question of living in peace with nature has to be looked at along with living in peace with people. And the notion of faunal nationalism was very powerful. It had a very important historical impact. I'm not sure it can be discarded, but definitely it is to be rethought. Can we have ecological patriotism, which is more just, more democratic, more open? And of course, this has huge implications because these life systems matter even more in the case of time of the Anthropocene than they did. Thank you.
A huge thank you for this presentation, Professor Rangarajan. It's extremely interesting when you're mentioning the importance of the tiger. One of the things that it has, as you're saying, if you compare the amount of death from the Spanish flu 100 years ago to the amount of death provided by this animal, it's of course it's laughable. But I think that one of the very interesting, the comparison doesn't stand at all in terms of lethality. But what's very interesting is that with the tiger, you touch upon one of those charismatic animals. You touch upon the idea of something that visually is very striking. And so my question is, like, do you think in the context that you study that it's a good strategy to keep putting emphasis on very charismatic species that are very visual, that are very impressive, and not, for example, on all of the degradations that occur because of the agricultural system, for example, that you're describing. So that would be my question to you.
No, obviously, this is a very small part of the larger environmental spectrum I've picked up. And it has its limitations. I want to emphasize with whether it's with tigers or other large carnivores, despite the fact India's density of population is probably 400 to a square kilometer. But just to give an idea, in 1880s, it was 80 to a square kilometer. And I always like reminding people, because I work in department a lot of ancient India historians, and they say, oh, you know, history is not only last 200 years ago. So just for record, 2000 years ago, the population density was 5 per square kilometer. So you go from 5 per square kilometer 2000 years ago to 400. It still has the largest populations of tigers, the Asian elephant in the world. It's much larger than many countries in Southeast Asia. I think a lot of this is because of a degree of cohabitation. I hesitate to use the word coexistence. And I want to emphasize it is many people who do not have land rights or have very low purchasing power, who have to spend a lot of labor time defending their fields, crops, or animals. They are the ones who are the loser. So I think that is an issue which needs to be addressed much more seriously. And it is a politically sensitive issue in India. And it is something which state governments do try to address. There is no way that one can say they managed to address it well. Nobody would argue that. Your other question, yes and no. I would argue, of course, the little things matter. And it could be argued that looking at soil bacteria, looking at a lot of smaller taxa could be enormously important. Let me share a very interesting point. In the same period we are looking at, in fact, shorter period, roughly the last 25 years, 95 to 97% of the vultures have vanished across India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And a lot of this is because of the use of very particular pesticide, injection, diclofenac. And this is used for cattle. Cattle health has improved enormously. It's a muscle relaxant. But this diclofenac works its way into the body of the vultures and the eggshell thickness goes down. So just as, you know, the bald eagle, peregrine falcon died out due to pesticides. Now, there's been a lot of action on this, but it has not turned around. And vulture health is probably a very good indicator of large part of the countryside than tiger health in ecological terms. So certainly one needs a much larger emphasis. And this kind of symbolic conservation, important as it is, can detract and take away. But this is clearest with the fact that a very large part of India is semi-arid. It's grasslands, scrub jungle. Probably the most endangered landscape would be the mangroves, which are very crucial for fish stock renewal. And now there is a very large effort to protect mangroves or even to regrow them. But yes, there can be many ways in which a big ticket symbolism detracts from larger debates. No question about it.